Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Max, and I'm very happy to have you here for this session on key trends and insights of Africa's startup funding landscape. This is going to be a very fast-paced session because we have a lot of ground to cover because there's a lot happening in the ecosystem. All the data that you're going to see today comes from a project called Africa the Big Deal that started back in 2019 with Maxime, who's pretty sorry is not able to join us today because he's going through a little bit of a logistical nightmare at the moment. But back in 2019, he started gathering data on deals in Africa because he realized that there were very few data sources. And it turns out that gathering this data is extremely important for investors, so they have an idea of what's happening in the market on top of all the research that they're doing, but also for entrepreneurs to get a sense of who are the investors that they could be targeting and the trends that they're seeing in the market. And I think generally speaking, it also acts as a really good source of data that attracts attention to the great things that are happening in the ecosystem. And since 2019, it's gathered 1,000 deals worth over $6 billion. And this is where I came in, basically. I've always been very interested in like data analysis and data visualization. So I kind of took all this data and starting playing with it. And earlier this year, we started publishing a newsletter every week that looks at cutting the data in different ways and producing this analysis and graphs and so on that can really act as conversation starters. So we're going to base all the presentation today on this data. And I'm going to turn my camera off now, and I suggest we dive straight into it.
So this slide, to begin with, almost doesn't need a voiceover. Actually, it would almost need a bit of clapping to actually celebrate how much has been done in 2019, in 2020, sorry, but most importantly in 2021. What we're looking at here is the amount of funding that was raised by startups in Africa through deals over $1 million. I'll stop for a second on this. We're using deals $1 million and over for comparison's sake between 2019, 2020, and 2021. Because when Maxime started in 2019, he was only looking at deals over $1 million, and then he lowered the bar in 2020 to deals over $500,000, and since the beginning of 2021 to deals $100,000 and over. But this has a limited impact on the graph, as the vast majority of the amount raised is actually raised through deals $1 million and over. This year, for instance, that's 97% of the amount raised through deals $1 million and over. So what we're seeing here is really good dynamic, obviously, in the first half of the year 2021 in yellow on this graph, followed by some kind of crazy hockey stick explosion in August and September. It's obviously fueled by some mega deals. For instance, the $400 million OPay Nigeria deals, or the $200 million Andela Series E, both actually with participation of SoftBank's Vision Fund 2. It might be a little bit hard to sustain this type of growth in the long run, but in any case, 2021 is a record year already with $3 billion, which is a pretty fantastic milestone, and it's on track basically for the amount raised in 2021 to surpass the amount that was raised in 2019 and 2020 combined. So now if we focus on 2021, so as I just said, $3 billion, actually already more than $3 billion raised through 575 deals, more than that, actually. We're already talking more than 600 deals because this data is a few days old, and Google announced 50 investments as part of their Black Founders Fund Africa portfolio earlier this month in October. So we're already well over the 600 deals this year. And here we're talking deals $100,000 and over. On the left, you see the type of explosion I was talking about in August and September. But also, I think it's worth noting that every single month was over $100 million raised, which is nothing like what we'd seen in 2019 and 2020, for instance. In the rest of the page, some areas that I'll be zooming in very shortly. First one, key numbers and facts: 43% of the funding raised by startups in Africa this year so far has been raised by startups in Nigeria. 55%, over half of the total amount, was raised by fintech startups. 92% was raised by a startup with a male CEO. And in terms of the investors who have been involved, though there are obviously disparities with some investors being extremely active, and we'll come back to that, and a majority only involved in one deal, we're still talking about more than 600 unique investors this year so far in Africa, which really shows the attractiveness of the continent and the ecosystem. Now, if we focus on geography, let's have a very quick look at the right-hand side to begin with. This is kind of the glass half empty, if you want. There are roughly half of African countries that have not registered a single startup deal over $1 million in the past 3 years. Actually, Sudan is the exception here because they've recently, if you want, graduated to the map on the left with a deal announced in October. But just to mention that when we're talking about the African ecosystem and startups in Africa, we're only talking about half of the countries. Now, if we move to the left-hand side, the glass half full, if I may, here we're showing the countries where at least one deal, $1 million and over, has been signed in the past 3 years. It's important to show that there are a lot of countries, I think, with funding activities. We hear a lot about the big four, they dominate, and actually my next slide is exactly about that. But it's important to show that there are a lot of countries where there is some good level of activities. And here we're only showing deals 1 million and over. There are obviously additional deals that are 100,000 and over that should graduate to deals 1 million and over, hopefully very soon. So now if we look at the big four, if I may, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya, here we're talking about more than 80% consistently of the funding raised. Here I'm showing growth both in volumes and percentages, because I think that if you're only showing percentages, you could lead to some kind of misconception. So for instance, if you look at the non-big four total, which I called here rest of Africa, if you look at those, the difference between 2019 and 2021 to date, for instance, the amount has grown a lot, but in terms of percentage of the overall amount raised by ecosystem has also grown. It is rather stable, but I wanted to show that there was growth there in terms of amount. What's interesting to note on this graph, Kenya had a really good year last year in 2020 and was really leading the pack then ahead of Nigeria. So far, it's a very different story in 2021. Actually, Kenya doesn't make it to the top 4 at this stage. There's been more money raised by startups in Senegal, technically. Actually, almost entirely that amount was driven by Wave's $200 million Series A in September, but still that's more money than money raised in Kenya, though Kenya has a lot more number of deals. There's been very good growth from the South African ecosystem and from the Egyptian ecosystem as well. And we're seeing crazy numbers coming out of Nigeria. If you look at 2021 to date, they're actually close to having raised in 2021 as much as the entire ecosystem had raised in 2019. So enough on geography now. If we look at sectors for a minute, well, this is the fintech show. Half of the funding raised since 2019 has gone to fintech. It is understandable, as payments are really a critical brick without which a lot of the other services can't exist, but still. And when we're talking fintech, we're talking mostly actually about fintech in Nigeria. Since 2019, more than half of the fintech funding has gone to Nigeria. So in summary, 25%, more than 25% of all the funding that's gone to startups in the past 3 years has gone to Nigerian fintech. If we look beyond fintech, there's energy. That's fueled in particular by the boom of pay-as-you-go solar home systems in the past few years, and logistics and transport. I think, again, there are very fundamental building blocks on which the rest of the economy and the activity of the continent is built. And they're followed by healthcare, by agri and food, by education and jobs in particular. And just take a note of deep tech. I'll come back to this one in a second. Now, who is the money going to? As I said in a previous slide, it's going to men. 92% of the funding goes to startups with a male CEO. On this slide, we're actually looking at the make of the funding teams. And here, basically, the message is that more than 80% of the funding goes to either a single male funder or a founding team made exclusively of men. In comparison, if we look at single female founders or founding teams made exclusively of women, they attract less than 1% of the funding. And they represent, however, 7% almost of the deals. But on the negative side, it means that also the deals that they're involved in are smaller in size than for their male counterparts. One deal that's worth talking about, and that got quite a bit of coverage this year, and rightly so, is Grow Intelligence 85 million round in Kenya. Not only was it the first large deep tech round in the ecosystem, and remember you saw it in the previous slide, but also it's a deal with a female CEO and a gender diverse founding team. These unfortunately are still pretty much an exception. Now, talking of founding teams, we also looked at the team size out of curiosity. So you've heard ad nauseum, I'm sure, that saying that if you want to go fast, you go alone. And if you want to go far, you go together. Well, actually, this seems to be very true for startups in Africa. 80% of the deals since 2019 have been signed by founding teams as opposed to single founders. And if you look at the largest deals, 10 millions and over, this percentage actually grows to almost 90%. So it's not surprising, as the more money you're raising as a startup, the more comfortable investors are likely to be to deal with a team rather than a one-man band or one-woman band. But to be honest, it's mostly one-man band. A founding pair actually seems to be the most common combination over the board. About 50% of the founding teams we looked at. Geographically, there are a few differences. In South Africa, there are more single founders and rarely a founding team of more than 3 people. In Egypt, however, you tend to have larger founding teams. Now, quickly and talking about geographical differences, there are quite a few when we look at where the CEOs studied. So if you look at Egypt and South Africa, you're looking at 2/3 of CEOs who have studied locally. While if you're looking at Nigeria, but Kenya in particular, you're looking at the vast majority of CEOs having studied in the US or in Europe. Now, for the next 3 slides, will be more geared to, I would say, to new investors or investors in the market and to entrepreneurs that are looking at raising their next round. So we hear a lot about pre-seed, seed, Series A, B, C, and more, and they're quite commonly used terms, but they mean very different things for different geographies, different sectors to different people. And there's a very wide range actually in terms of what they mean. If we look at our database, you can actually find $5 million round that have been labeled by the respective startups as pre-seed, seed, Series A, or Series B. So for the same amount. That said, we can find some trends. So pre-seed, for instance, will tend generally to be between $100,000 and $300,000 for most of the deals. Seed is around $1 million. Can be a bit bigger than that, but it's if you look at the median, it's $1 million. A Series A will be in the millions, and a Series B will be in the tens of millions. Then again, the Wave deal in Senegal that I mentioned earlier, it was $200 million and is labeled as a Series A. It's not on this slide, which was done a little bit earlier this year, but it just shows you what kind of range you can be talking about. Also here, we're talking about fintech, which tends to have probably larger amounts raised, generally speaking, and different definition for round sizes. Now, who's investing all that money? Remember, I mentioned more than 600 unique investors in Africa this year so far. The majority of the investors are from outside the continent, which I would say on the positive side reflects the attractivity of the ecosystem, but it also calls for more local investors, of course, to fuel the local growth. Outside of Africa, North America and Europe dominate. There's geographical proximity for Europe, there's common networks, and there's also very strong diasporas in both geographies. Asia Pacific is still behind. China is almost shockingly almost absent, and compared to preconceptions. I think it's worth mentioning. Japan is very active, but that's mostly through a couple players, in particular Keppel Africa. Which actually takes us to our almost last slide, where we're showing here the heavy hitters when it comes to investors in Africa. First of all, most of them are based on the continent, with very strong presence on the continent, and they operate, as you can see, in a growing number of countries for most of them. This slide does not include the Google investments that I mentioned earlier and were announced very recently. It also does not show other players, which we know are also very active, but do not always disclose their deals or might not have disclosed them yet. But it doesn't mean that they're not doing a lot in the ecosystem. I'm thinking Future Africa, for instance. And I think a special shout out should go to Launch Africa on the left of the slide, who have somehow managed to sign more than a deal a week since the beginning of the year in 9 markets in total. Now, this is the last content slide. So it's probably hard to read in a few seconds, especially if your connection is not particularly great. But what's important here is that we're sometimes hearing negative comments about how the African ecosystem overall is still at a very early stage in terms of volume of funding compared to other fast-growing regions. So we wanted to test that assumption very quickly. So we looked at the funding raised per capita in 2020. At a regional level, we're talking $1.4 raised per inhabitant in Africa. And we're still indeed far from other countries on the graph, like India or even China. But I don't really like this number because Africa is definitely not a country, and it hides a lot of differences between different regions. But we've been asked for this number, so we've included it so people have a comparison point. So I prefer really to look at a country level. Starting with Nigeria, obviously, as I said, this year in particular, the numbers are really high, even though here we're based on 2020 numbers. But in terms of dollar raised per capita, Nigeria compares actually closer to like Philippines, for instance, because despite raising large amounts, it also has the largest population on the continent. South Africa, with at about $5 raised per capita, is comparable to Russia, and Kenya. And remember, Kenya had a pretty phenomenal year in 2020 in terms of amount raised. At $11 per capita, Kenya does better, significantly better than countries like Mexico or even India. And I thought that was interesting to mention here. I'm going to stop here, unfortunately, because we're already out of time. But there's obviously much more that could be said, much more that could be written, and so much more actually. If you want to find actually on each of those slides, there's a full analysis, short and sweet, but also more details directly on the website and newsletter. That's thebigdeal.substack.com. and the database, which I mentioned, 1,000 deals, soon more than 1,000 deals worth $6 million, which you can find at thebigdeal.gumroad.com, and which is if you reach out to us, it's always available with a little discount if you need it. In particular, if you're an African startup looking to raise funding soon. So to close here, thank you very much to the organizer for the opportunity to present, of course. Thanks everybody for listening in. And then again, remember at least half of the credit here goes to my friend Maxime, who could not join today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event, and thank you very much for listening.